theme for today has to do with the city, and specifically we're talking about the gospel in the city, the message of the gospel, and what it requires from us in an urban ministry setting. So first of all, let us read the text. It says, "When I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God, for I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power." It's interesting. He says, "I resolved to know nothing except Jesus Christ and him crucified," two things. When we hear Paul speaking to us in the beginning, our first impression is that he's speaking to us about the attractiveness of his message, about, if you will, how shiny it is, how it draws people. But perhaps if we could take a moment, maybe we could see something a little deeper, a richer context for what he's trying to tell us. Earlier in the book, leading up to this point, we see Paul talk about divisions in the church, and he says that some people are trying to gather up into one camp or another, and he also speaks about how Jews are looking for miraculous signs and how the Greeks are looking for wisdom. And like I said, we think of this as attractiveness. If in an urban setting you use a message that uses words that people are familiar with, urban lingo, urban analogies, that perhaps they'll be attracted to and drawn to it. But I think Paul is pointing to a deeper theme here, a theme that might not be apparent right off the bat, and I think that theme is authority. I think that a lot of what we're trying to do when we use rich analogies and we try to be wise and eloquent is that we're trying to gain authority in the eyes of the people that we're talking to. In the Corinthian church, Paul says that I didn't baptize many of you, and that looks like one of the ways that people would gain authority is they would have more people baptized, and then also they would have more followers. So one person would be like, I follow Apollos or I follow Paul, and what they're trying to say is that I'm part of a camp that has many followers, and so that leader has more authority. And if someone followed a well-followed camp, they, through that process, would gain authority of their own. I think we see that in urban context today. We have popular star preachers, John Piper, Louis Giglio. We have leaders we look up to, and I think we recognize in the urban context that there's a lot of cultural leaders, a lot of voices that beg to be heard, actors, musicians, new ideas, and because there's so many ideas out there, because there's marketing, cities are filled with billboards and messages. The TVs and commercials are constantly asking for your attention, asking for authority. So the only way for your voice to rise among the variety of voices that occur in an urban setting is to create your own authority, to gather it up, to gather followers, to come up with methods for doing that. And as technology develops, we get even more forms of that with Facebook and Twitter. You literally have followers oftentimes. And I think that in urban ministry, we find ourselves ending up using a lot of gimmicks in order to reach people's hearts, in order to gain this authority. But I think, like he was saying here, that this is a pursuit we should not get caught up into. He says, I resolved to know nothing except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And let me try to develop this theme here using some words of Jesus. If we turn to Matthew chapter 21, we actually see some Pharisees come to Jesus and ask him about this question of authority. And I think this is very important to recognize that the Pharisees were part of a group in a city trying to gain their own authority versus the Sadducees, the Essenes, among a variety of groups in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, and they're fighting back and forth for their authority. And so for them, authority was a very real issue. And if you know a lot about the book of Matthew, they say that Jesus being portrayed as a Jew was a matter of Matthew's attempt to raise Jesus' authority in the eyes of the reader. So authority is a very real issue in the book of Matthew. Um, but I think Jesus kind of exposes some of the real subtext behind why do we want authority as ministers? Why is it just because we're trying to draw people to ourselves? Here in Matthew 21, verses 23, it says, Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him. By what authority are you doing these things, they asked, and who gave you this authority? Jesus replied, I will also ask you one question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or from men? They discussed it among themselves and said, if we say from heaven, he will ask, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say from men, we are afraid of the people, for they all hold that John was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we don't know. Then he said, neither will I tell you what authority I am doing these things. I find it interesting that Jesus did not ask a random trivia question. The question he asked was very intentional. There's a reason why he wanted to ask him this question first. You see, he responds and asks them a question that sort of challenges their authority, because either way they answer the question, their authority is by and lessened. Because if they say that John was not real, that his was only an earthly ministry, didn't have a blessing from God, then they upset the people who disagree with them, and they lose authority in their eyes by upsetting them. But then also, if they answer that John's ministry was from heaven, it was from real, it clearly contradicts their position. Although they never verbally said it, I think is widely known that they were not in support of John. So they appear to be flip-flopping, and so their authority loses value. Because, I mean, modern politicians today are even attacked for flip-flopping on issues, and you can imagine, even from how we understand it, that their authority would lessen. They would seem less holy and less knowledgeable. So they take a route that makes their authority stay the same. They say, we don't know. And here we see that authority is not authority is not the real issue. There's something deeper. Because if the Pharisees wanted to use their authorities as a tool for drawing people closer to God, then truth would be essential to them. They would try to come up with the truest answer, and they would probably have answered that it was a ministry from earth. They would have tried to teach truth to the people looking to them. But instead, you see there's something more valuable than truth at play here. It's their own personal value. If I'm a minister with lots of followers, then that means that my own value as a minister increases. And so you get the sense that one's authority as a minister and followers gets wrapped up in your identity. My value increases as I have more followers. I think that is part of Satan's trap in modern urban ministry. When we're trying to gather followers, when we're trying to gather popularity, there's a sense in which our own value as ministers is in play here. And it's very cloudy and it gets mixed up. And I think that's why Jesus says, I won't tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. Because the authority that we try to gather up by our gimmicks, by our gathering like special pastors and books, are just gimmicks to raise up our authority and our values, to validate our ministries. But instead, I think Jesus really rejects that view. Turning over to John chapter 5, verses 41 through 44, we see that he rejects this idea of gathering authority for oneself. He says, I do not accept praise from men, but I know you. I know that you do not have the love of God in your hearts. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me, but if someone else comes in his own name, you will accept him. How can you believe if you accept praise from one another, yet make no effort to attain the praise that comes from only God? If our job as ministers is to make ourselves look higher and mightier, even if we say that that's to draw people to Christ, I think that is a lie and a mistake. Because, I mean, there is sort of a tension, because we do need authority to speak into people's lives. If we as ministers don't have authority, people aren't going to listen to us. But I think we go about it entirely the wrong way. Because, like I said, we use gimmicks, we use popular pastors, popular books. If we have the church that has 10,000 people inside of it, people don't really care about our theology anymore. They just notice we have a lot of people, and our message gets watered down. And the real authority that is able to change people's lives dissipates and disappears, because our idea of authority comes from the world. And that's not where our idea of authority comes from. I think this is where we get the statement in Corinthians that we are to know Christ and him crucified. To point to Christ, I would say, is to point to the inherent message of the gospel of grace that has an authority that speaks of its own. I think to support the idea, we have Matthew 7:28 through 29. And it's a very short passage, but I think it says something very beautiful. It says, "When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law." And their teachers of the law, like I said, were trying to gather authority like crazy. But when Jesus spoke, he had authority that came from God, that came from his Father. There's a message, there's a power behind Jesus' words that does not need our efforts to make it larger, to make it more important in people's eyes. If it stands alone, it itself is able to turn people's hearts. And then the other one is Christ crucified. And I would like to tell you that is a message of servanthood, that when Jesus was crucified on the cross, it was him coming and humbling himself and serving us. And this, again, is reinforced by more from Matthew in chapter 20, verses 25 through 28. Here it says, "Jesus called them together and said, 'You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.'" So Jesus says that if you want to become great in people's eyes, if you want to garner authority, the way to do that is to be a servant. And I think that both of these ideas are especially important for an urban setting because, as I said, there's millions of voices crying out to be heard, saying that they have authority, and even doing ridiculous things to gather that authority, gimmicks, doing something just to get attention. I remember someone telling me coming to college that the key to popularity is to be remembered, whether those are for good things or for bad things. Which is actually quite a sad idea because it does not matter for what we are known as long as we are known. And that's the major trap of urban ministry. There's so many people. That's the idea of urban ministry. The idea that city is so important is that there's so many people. And even though we are trying to reach so many people, and that's a benefit, a plus, the negative is because there's so many people, there are so many sources of authority that are clamoring to be heard. And if we join in that rat race as ministers, our voices are going to be drowned out. People aren't going to pay attention to us. But if we instead take a two-pronged approach to ministering in the city, the first of which is proclaiming the clear truth of the gospel without trying to do too much with it, without trying to play around with it, turn it into something new, like in Acts when it's like, oh, let's hear this new idea. It's not a new idea. It's a clear, truth-filled idea that's been proclaimed for centuries. And then the second approach is to be servants, to proclaim the truth. And then when we come into these communities in which there's real suffering, when there's real damage, when there's a multiplicity of people, there's many sources of sin, many people harming each other back and forth. And that means all the more that us as ministers walking in, that our renewed lives are going to be set apart. And we're to be ministers of reconciliation, to be healing people. And that's really an important idea. That'll set us apart from any other kind of authority that there is. So, as I said, two things. A clear gospel, clear message of the truth, and then to serve people. Thank you.